Hey folks, welcome to the April Sew Along. We have a really fun design for you this month. But before I announce what it is, I would like to congratulate everyone who made a Tulip Fields hanger in March. I thoroughly enjoyed looking at all your beautiful projects. The fun design we are making this month is the Neighbourhood Novelty Blocks and Quilt. You can make this quilt in the 4x4, 5x5, 6x6 and the 7x7 hoop. In this video, I will show you the stitch out of Cottage 2, Roof 1, path sashing, and the construction of the Neighbourhood Novelty Blocks and Quilt. We recommend you follow the photograph written instructions provided in conjunction with this video. If you haven't already, go join the April Sew Along group on Facebook to receive a 30% discount on this design. The link will be in the description below. If you enjoy Sweet Pea's tutorial on the Neighbourhood Novelty Blocks and Quilt Sew Along, please like and subscribe. Let's start off with Cottage 2. Begin by hooping up cutaway stabilizer in the hoop and load the design onto your machine. Then place batting 1 on top of the hoop and stitch the batting down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the batting about 1 to 2 mm from the stitching. Stitch the placement lines for the sky. Place fabric A right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement line. Stitch down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 mm from the stitching. Leave the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting on the sky. Repeat the applique process with the ground using fabric B. Trim, leaving the excess fabric in the seams. Then embroider the satin stitch around the ground. Repeat the applique process with the cottage using fabric C. Trim. Then embroider the detail and then satin stitch along the cottage. Repeat the applique process with the front part of the cottage using fabric D. Trim. Embroider part of the grass near the front door. Embroider the satin stitch along the front part of the cottage. Repeat the applique process with the roof using fabric E. Trim. Then embroider the detail and then satin stitch along the roof. Embroider the heart. Repeat the applique process with the door using fabric F. And trim. Embroider the doorknob and then the satin stitch around the door. Here you can add your own number to your door. Embroider the leaves, flower and pot plant near the front door. Repeat the applique process with the path using fabric G. Trim, leaving the excess fabric in the seams. Then embroider the detail and satin stitch around the path. Repeat the applique process with the windows. using pieces of fabric large enough to cover the placement lines. And trim. Embroider the curtains and curtain details. Embroider the satin stitch along the top of the windows. Then the window sills. Embroider the vine. Embroider the grass along the path. Embroider the flowers on the ground. Awesome job! You have now completed the stitch out of your first block. Now remove your work from the hoop and trim the seams to about 1/2 inch using a rotary cutter and ruler. Hold aside until all your blocks are made. Moving on to roof 1. Hoop up cutaway stabilizer in the hoop and load the design onto machine. Repeat the stitch down and trimming process for batting 1. Place fabric A right side up on top of the hoop covering the batting and stitch down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 mm from the stitching. Leave the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting on the sky. Repeat the applique process with the first set of leaves using fabric B. Trim. Then embroider the sad stitch along that set of leaves. Repeat the applique process with the second set of leaves using fabric C. Trim. Then embroider the satin stitch along the set of leaves. Repeat the applique process with the last set of leaves using fabric D. Trim. Then embroider the satin stitch along the set of leaves. Embroider the trunk. Embroider the squirrel. Repeat the applique process with the roof using fabric E. Trim, leaving the fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting on the roof. Embroider the decorative stitch above the roof. Embroider the satin stitch along the roof. Repeat the applique process with the window using a piece of fabric large enough to cover the placement line. Trim. Embroider the satin stitch around the window. Embroider the window sill and the satin stitch above the window. Embroider the decorative stitch along the top of the window. Remove from the hoop and trim the seams about 1/2 inch. Hold aside until all your blocks are made. To make the path sashing, hoop up cutaway stabilizer in the hoop and load the design onto your machine. Then repeat the stitch down and trimming process for batting 1. Stitch the placement lines for the ground. Place fabric A right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement lines. Stitch down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 mm from the stitching. Leave the excess fabric in the seams. Repeat the applique process with the paths using fabric B. Trim, leaving the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the detail and satin stitch along the paths. Embroider the grass along the paths. Remove from the hoop and trim the seams to about 1/2 inch. Hold aside until all your blocks are made. Joining the blocks. Lay out your blocks on a flat surface and decide on your layout. There are a few different variations on layouts you can achieve with these blocks. Here is an example we decided to do for our quilt. Here are some examples of other layouts you can do. Start off by joining the blocks in rows. Place the first 2 blocks right sides together. Pin and stitch the side seam on your sewing machine. Stitch just inside the border already stitched on the blocks, so the stitching will not be seen on the right side later. Open the stitch seams and iron flat. Continue this until you have joined the remaining blocks in that row together. Continue this until you have each horizontal row of blocks joined. Next, join the horizontal rows to each other by placing the first two rows right sides together. Pin and stitch the seams on your sewing machine. Stitch just inside the border already stitched on the blocks, so the stitching will not be seen on the right side later. Open out the stitch seams and iron flat. Continue this until you have joined all the horizontal rows together. Cut the backing. Place your backing binding fabric on your table, wrong sides facing up. Place your sewn quilt blocks on top of the backing binding fabric, wrong sides together. Lightly spray your backing fabric to the back of your quilt to help the blocks stay in place while stitching in the ditch. Alternatively, you can place safety pins approximately 4 inches apart across the whole front of the quilt, going through all layers. We place a piece of cardboard down when we spray the adhesive to protect the front of our quilt blocks. To join the backing to the quilt, stitch in the ditch along the straight seams where each block is joined. Make sure your bobbin thread is the same colour as your backing fabric. Trim the excess backing so it is exactly 1 1/4 inches bigger around the quilt blocks. We use the cutting ruler and rotary cutter to do this. Starting on any side, fold the backing fabric in half so the raw edge of the backing is up against the raw edge of the quilt blocks. Then fold it in half again, this time making sure you fold it just over your seam stitching and pin. Continue pinning your binding until you reach your first corner. Every time you fold the fabric, use an iron to press the fold. When you get to the corner, try and make a nice mitered corner. Turn your binding in at the corner and continue folding the same way as we did the first side of our binding. You can iron the folds as you go if this helps with your mitered corners. Fold a final time and pin the corner in place. Continue folding, ironing and pinning your way around the hanger. Starting anywhere, sew the binding to the quilt blocks just inside the folded edge of the binding. If you want, change your bobbin thread to match your backing. When you get to the corner, simply leave your needle down and lift the foot and rotate. Put your foot down and continue stitching in this fashion until you're right around the quilt blocks. Give your quilt a good press with the iron. You have now finished your project. Well done. Hopefully, you are all now looking at an amazing new quilt with your own spark of creativity. I hope you found this tutorial useful. Remember to post photos of your finished project on the April Sew Along group, and let's celebrate all of our amazing projects together. Check out our online store for more beautiful machine embroidery designs and sewing essentials at swepea.com. That is swpea.com. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you next month.